Hello everyone and welcome back to Misconceptions in History, and today we're going to take a step back from all the naval stuff I've been doing and we're going to start looking at aircraft. And I figured what better place to look at this than the dawn of aerial combat itself, World War I. So we're going to be looking at what made World War I so unique in terms of aerial aviation combat. Now when we talk about World War I aviation, this aircraft right here, piloted by Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, probably comes to your mind. Maybe even think back to the old days of Snoopy comics and things like that. Or maybe you saw the 2006 movie Flyboys, which had some pretty decent aerial combat in it. Or maybe you enjoy video games and you enjoyed playing the video game Battlefield 1, which personally I absolutely enjoyed the aerial combat in that. So how did we get to aerial combat? In all honesty, by 1909, only 6 years after the development of the Wright brothers aircraft, the Wright brothers had actually created what is known as the Wright Flyer Model A, which is also known as the military flyer. And this was basically a test bed for military usage of aircraft. This aircraft was doing the role of early dirigibles and hot air balloons, and it was a reconnaissance aircraft. And that's what the early aircrafts were used when we hit World War I. In fact, the Germans managed to basically turn an entire battle against the Russians during the Battle of Tannenberg in eastern Prussia because of early reconnaissance created by aircraft. And that same year, we get the first time an aircraft actually brings down another aircraft after an Austrian reconnaissance aircraft was rammed by a Russian pilot, Pyotr Nesterovov, on the Eastern Front. And this is actually going to lead pilots to start arming themselves. And actually, they didn't arm themselves initially with guns. They actually preferred grenades and other throwing objects like grappling hooks to try and bring down an opposing force's aircraft. At the time, handguns and small arms weren't really that effective to shoot while flying. Now, the British did come up with some of the earlier ideas of arming an aircraft. Now, they created what was known as the Vickers Experimental Fighting Biplane 1, which was basically an aircraft in what's known as the pusher configuration, of which the engine actually is backwards and the propeller pushes the aircraft, and they mounted a machine gun on the front. And this would eventually evolve into the Fighting Biplane 5, which would become commonplace by 1915. And this style of mounting the gun in the front actually would become standard practice. However, this wasn't the only way they would arm aircraft. Another common method was to literally slap the gun on the top of the wing and fire from above the wing. This did have some advantages, however, it left the gunner very exposed. Now, in order to improve accuracy, there was the idea of shooting through the propeller. Obviously, this presents problems as you could shoot the propeller. One solution to this was known as the Morane-Salyers wedge-style propellers, in which basically they fitted these metal wedges. The bullets are supposed to hit them, and it would deflect off and fire forward, almost creating like a shotgun style of effect. Now, this would all change with something known as machine gun synchronization. Now, machine gun synchronization essentially is the idea that every time you fire, you're firing between the swipe of the propeller blade. And eventually, this would be designed to be a gear system, basically stalling out the propeller, temporarily allowing you to shoot between the blades. And this basically presented a much easier way of shooting because now you weren't having to basically tune the gun for a firing position. Instead, you're now just aiming your gun straight ahead from you, and you had much accurate fire. And this is going to lead to a rapid development in aircrafts over the course of World War I. We go from these pusher configurations, which were real popular in the early war, to what we see a lot more common monoplane and biplane designs. You're also going to start seeing what's known as trench strafing, which is the early version of close air support that you see very commonly with the world's most favorite aircraft in terms of close air support, the A-10. Next, we're going to see the development of bombing aircraft. Now, early bombing aircraft were essentially the standard aircraft, and the weight of the bombs were pretty much limited by what the pilot could carry, because early bombers basically dropped the bomb straight from the pilot. He would reach over the side and drop it. Later on, they started figuring out how to attach it to the wings, which means we had to start building purpose-built bombers. Now, these purpose-built bombers had incredibly heavy load capabilities for their time, which is why they had to have large engines, and they had to keep getting larger and larger. Like here seen in the Reisenflugzeug, which was also known as the R series of aircraft, which were ridiculously large German bombers. Now, to put that into perspective, the Siemens and Schuckert R8 seen here in this photo had a wingspan of 157 feet. Put that in comparison to the wingspan of a B-17, which was only 103 feet. That's more than a 40-foot difference between planes that were 30 years apart. And while it didn't have the bombing capability of the B-17, this was the heavy bomber of its day. However, this wasn't the only bombing option at the time, the other being the Zeppelin. That's right, over 100 years ago, Britain was actually bombed by a series of Zeppelin attacks, and it actually did some pretty devastating attacks. So essentially a combination of these heavy bombers and these big blimps were used to attack Britain, and as a result, we get something called anti-aircraft development. Now, it was inevitable that anti-aircraft would be developed. The British really got on it to deal with the strategic bombing that was occurring on their country, and they actually developed multiple things. In addition to weapons, they actually developed what's known as the air raid siren that actually would become crucial during the bombing campaign of World War II. Now, all of these firsts lead up to the development of aerial combat. It's also the time of war we're going to see more leading ace pilots than probably any other, with 1,800 ace pilots during this war, including Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and his 80 kills. Or you can get William Avery Bishop of the Royal Air Force and his 72 kills. And the highest of the United States was only Edward Vernon Rickenbacker, who I talked about in conjunction with Billy Mitchell, who only had 26 kills. But in this one conflict, we're going to see the first dogfight in history, the first air-to-air kill, the first aerial victory with a forward-pointing gun, the first flying ace. You know, things like this, the first bombing campaign, are all going to take place in one conflict. So there we have just a brief look at World War I aviation, the dawn of aerial combat. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you all about more aircraft in the future.